Great. Well, thank you, everyone. Welcome. I know we're in a few different time zones here. So when I talk to groups about core values, I like to get a feel for where the audience is here. I'm not going to be able to ask you to raise your hands today, but this is a question I ask. Do you know what you value? And I would encourage you to think honestly about one of these possible answers. So, the first is I may have core values, but I haven't thought much about them. I've thought about my core values, but I don't really have a definitive list. And I have a written list and I consult it regularly. And look, I've asked this question to a bunch of different groups. My experience is that this is kind of typically how the room breaks down on average. About 60 people haven't thought about it that much. The next group has a vague idea and might have some one word values like integrity. And about two people will have a defined list of written core values that they reference. And here's what I found in talking to those few people who have concretely identified their values. They're fully engaged by their work. They tend to be in a community that represents what they care about most, or communities, and they're pursuing goals that align to values. At the highest level, they're really reaching their full potential. And so that begs the question, well, what about the rest? Now, a lot of them are doing good things. They're working hard. They're helping others show up, but they're often kind of doing it on autopilot. And autopilot can be really effective when things are going well, but autopilot doesn't work very well when there's something hard or a crisis or an accident. My experience, it's not really a recipe for greatness. And here's what those people are kind of often questioning: their confidence in a decision, how people should perceive them, what they should be doing, and where they belong. And look, you may be in that 40% that started this work, or maybe you figured it out as a leader, but a lot of people in your organization probably haven't. And with that many people potentially on autopilot, I think your organization is not going to perform at a high level. Now, when I talk about core values, I know it often sounds abstract or even spiritual, but there's a lot more data and science than you would think that kind of shows the importance. So, first and foremost, when it comes to life satisfaction, people living in congruence with their values have a 30% higher satisfaction, higher engagement, according to an NIH study. Look, we're living through an anxiety and burnout crisis in the workplace today, and people whose daily actions reflect their values show 30 to 40% lower levels of depression and anxiety, really even the same efficacy as some major pharmaceutical products. With respect to decisions and regret, people who clearly define their personal values are up to 35% more likely to make confident decisions, and they experience significantly fewer regrets, especially under pressure, probably because they know they're making good decisions. And last but not least, trust is in pretty short supply these days. And how do you think it might help you or your team if your leaders were seen as 3 times more trustworthy? Now, I know the world feels a little upside down today. I think one of the main reasons is that we've become very tribal as people. There's a lot of pressure to join the latest thing or pick a side because of pressure or groupthink. And there's a lot of reasons for this. I suspect part of why we become so tribal is because too few people actually know what they value with any clarity. And for me, core values really are that anchor. They help you make smart, consistent, and principled decisions that stand the test of time. So let's take a deeper dive into values, and I'm going to challenge you to really think about kind of what you want most and how you show up in the world. So first, what impact do you want to make on the people you lead? How do you want to shape, mentor, and influence others? If you are or hope to be a parent one day, what values do you want to pass along to your children? And for those who are parents, how do you want your kids to show up in the world? What do you want other people to say about who they are? And this is always a little bit more of a gut punch, but how do you want to be remembered when you're gone? What will the people who come to your funeral and speak say about you? And what is your legacy going to be? Now, the answers to these questions are all pillars of your core values. They dictate how you show up, how you lead, how you parent, and how you'll ultimately be remembered. And to act on them, you kind of first need to be clear about what they are. So my own journey with core values began in 2013. I was invited as part of Entrepreneurs Organization to a pretty prestigious global leadership academy with about 20 other people from around the world. And I showed up expecting to learn the tactics of how to be a better leader. And imagine my surprise when we spent the first 2 days kind of being asked to look in the mirror. We were really challenged to think deeply about what mattered to us and what did we value and how could we lead from that place. And I really took that away from me. I left that week realizing the importance of core values, but they kind of left us hanging because I didn't know what mine were, and we weren't given a process for that. I did the hard work. It took me about 6 months, but after 6 months, I had this list of core values on my desk that I have kept to this day now for almost a decade. And it really just felt like the missing piece in the puzzle of my life. And I made a lot of major changes in my personal life, in my company and company policies, with family and friendships based on awareness of those values. And, it actually didn't really even totally hit me for the first time how impactful this was until a few years ago when I heard my bio read before I was about to give a speech. This is a bio that I often kind of used for speaking. And what I realized that day was this was the part before I had figured out my core values. And this was everything else that came after the 8 books, the CEO awards, the podcast, the Friday Forward newsletter. In fact, I'm pretty sure this is the only reason I'm speaking to you here today. So let's dig into the what, the why, and the how of core values. And I think that starts with a definition. For me, this is kind of a simple definition. It's kind of your North Star. Core values are your most important non-negotiable principles. And you might not realize they're non-negotiable, but they're there. And unfortunately, we see a lot of bad core value examples. Core values are not kind of BS platitudes designed to look good on a wall or a web page. Remember that 40% of people that only had a vague idea about their values, they might be thinking of values like these. And I can tell you, it's interesting. I'm doing a lot of corporate core values work as well these days. And what I've noticed is that companies think they're super clever with these core value acronyms, but employees often remember the acronym, but they don't even know what the values are underlying it. And this is my friend Gary Ridge, who is the former CEO of WD-40, the little oil can company. Gary's a huge proponent of core values, and he completely turned around the company and the culture in his 10 years there. And Gary used to say, if someone makes a decision based on their core values at the company, they were safe. Not only does that say a lot about the culture at that company, but it kind of made me wonder when I heard that, which is like, how do we know that we're safe with our personal decisions if we don't understand our core values? So what's keeping you from danger in your most important decisions? And in terms of decisions, like the biggest ones are what I call the big three. And these are where core values are most important by far. So this is your chosen partner or your spouse, your vocation or your career. So it could be the work you do or the specific company that you choose to do it with. And also is your community or communities, where you live, who you spend time with, what you choose to give your time to. I think this one is often most overlooked in terms of values and congruence. And look, here's the reality. These will not work, these big three, without core values alignment. I've been coaching. I was coaching someone recently who's actually going through a divorce. And it was interesting as she figured out her core values, she turned to me and she said, wow, I just realized like my soon to be ex is the antithesis of all of these values. And that really wasn't a surprise for me. So this kind of begs the question, like, where do these core values come from or originate? And for most people, like, I think their values have been with them for a long time. Therefore, it's really a process of discovery. You're not kind of innovating or inventing them. You're kind of uncovering them. And in a way, you're really looking for that instruction manual that no one ever gave you, to yourself. And there's often a reason why you didn't get it, particularly at birth, by default. And that's because you're not really born. My experience is you're not born with most of your values. They're really forged by these formative life experiences in your childhood and your adolescence. And I've seen this because when I interview leaders on my podcast who are doing kind of amazing things, my first question is always about their childhood. And it almost inevitably connects in some way to what it is that they're doing today. And when you do this core values work, you're going to end up looking back to your early years. And that's where many of the clues lie. And I think the more honest we are about that, the better we can get to answers. And a lot of those come from these formative moments of your life. As I said, this is where a lot of the clues lie. Some of you in a workplace or trust might have done something called a lifeline exercise, where you kind of lay out all these high and low points on your life. It's a really good example of those things that kind of stood out and impacted us. And my experience is that most core values come from kind of two different spectrums. Something that was important to you or that you're doubling down on. And I can share a story about that. I remember doing this work with an employee, and they shared that one of their core values was discipline. They loved working out and organizing their space and being on time. And this process and structure was really important to them. And I've done this a while. So as soon as they finished explaining this value, I was pretty certain I knew where it came from. So I asked them a question, and it turned out my hunch was right. They came from a military family, and this value of discipline was really a core part of their personal operating system. But just as often, if not more, I think in cases, something you're really running away from or trying to do the opposite is the foundation of a core value. It could be something that was painful, even if something good came out of it. Similarly, I had an employee that was doing this with a parent, this work, and talked about this parent who lacked in self-awareness. They couldn't read a room. They always had one drink too many. They always said the wrong thing. And this had become an ongoing source of embarrassment for them. So self-awareness had become a core value. And unknowingly, they were super tough on their team as a leader when they saw a lack of self-awareness. Up until this point, they just hadn't put two and two together. And so then they went back to their team, explained it to them, explained how it was this red line, and they kind of gave their team the playbook to manage you. So again, when you're brainstorming your core values, look for these clues in childhood. And what I'm talking about today is this concept of actionable core values. So these are the four elements that are really important to an actionable core value: a constant non-negotiable principle, a distinct definition and point of view, a 2 to 5 word phrase, and a decision-making rubric. And these components are really key for them to be helpful in decision making. That's where the actionable piece come from. So I'll just give you a second here to write them down and take a picture. All right. So we talked about the what. Let's talk about the why. And look, this is the iceberg that brought down the Titanic. On the surface, it doesn't look that imposing, but like most icebergs, it look very different below the surface. And this is kind of where values live. Above the water is what the world sees. Below is what's not seen, but is often more important. And you need to be aware of what's below your surface. Core values are a huge part of leadership. Most leaders initially are kind of a patchwork quilt of things that they loved about their favorite leaders and things they desperately want to do the opposite of some of the worst leaders they ever had. I know this is how I led initially, and I can remember one very specific circumstance where I copied someone else's approach for something, and it felt horrible, and I realized I needed to do something different because it wasn't me. Because what this sort of for and against strategies have in common is they aren't authentic and they're not you. And I spoke at a company event a few years ago, and they shared their leadership standard doc with me. And this is about the expectation and the standards for leaders, kind of what they should do, some of the behavior, but it can't tell you what kind of leader to be. My experience is that everyone leads differently, and they do so from their values, whether they realize it or not. So either you're in control with awareness of these values, or your values are kind of driving your leadership from the passenger seat. And often they're triggering reactions and behaviors that you might not fully understand. It's kind of like your shadow. And I can't tell you how many conversations I've observed where two people are bringing a deep held principle or value to work without knowing about it. And here's a perfect example. I remember overhearing a dispute about a budget between two leaders. The person on the left felt like they weren't being heard. The person on the right thought the other person was needlessly wasting money. I knew them both really well. And what was going on was deeply rooted formative childhood experiences rising to the surface. The kid on the left didn't feel heard growing up and has a core value that everyone's perspective needs to be heard. And the kid on the right grew up poor and was taught to make every penny count and be happy with what you have. And their values were in conflict. And when you know your values, you can often find a lot of the why behind that conflict. And as I mentioned before in the self-awareness example, when you're aware of these invisible forces that are guiding your behavior, they're not going to change, particularly if you're 30 or 40 or 50 and you're in the workplace. But you can better communicate what matters to you as a leader. When the leaders in my company discovered their values, they would go back to their teams and present them. They felt free to be themselves and help them lead more authentically. And we took the data. Their performance improved dramatically within 3 to 6 months after going back and sharing this with your team. So when you do this with your team and the people you work with, they begin to understand where your red lines are. They know how to manage you. For example, if trust is a core value of yours, you might say, trust is really important to me. Here are the ways it's broken. And please come to me if you feel like there's some distance, as there's probably been a loss of trust, right? That's the most honest thing that you could do. And here's an analogy for how this awareness changes your life in leadership. Think of driving a car in a dark tunnel with no lights. You might hit a wall, make a horrible noise, pull back, you'll drift to the other side, and then it happens again. Look, you're probably going to make it through the tunnel, but your car is going to be pretty damaged and beat up. Now, imagine instead you have these bright lines showing on the road. It's easy to stay in your lane, avoid hitting the wall. The lines are your core values and the lights are your awareness of them, and your car is going to look a lot better when at the end of this journey. And sometimes it's more than just a scratch. The goal really is to be aware of that iceberg. And these values and clarities around them are what I call this compass within. You just need to know what it is and how to read it to make those decisions. So I really want to explain how this all comes together in a story about a child who was raised by a single mother. His mother was only 16 when she had him, and his father was absent. The mother worked multiple jobs to put her son through school. They were both on food stamps. They moved from one bad neighborhood to the other pretty regularly. And the kid just felt really left behind in school. And he also felt that he wasn't given the chance to meet his academic potential. But the family persevered. Ultimately, the boy graduated high school. He went on to reach the top of his field and build $1 billion empire. But the very beginning of his professional success, he started giving back, focus on underserved kids. He founded a school designed to better serve kids in underprivileged areas, and to date has donated over $100 million to educational charity. He's serving the kids that are in the same situation that he was in when he was younger. And his experience sort of became this motivation to create what he needed. And this is pretty common story. I think my experience is that purpose and pain are often located pretty close to each other. And there's a lot of good that comes out of struggle. In fact, a good friend of mine likes to say that many of our gifts lie next to our deepest wounds. Now, a lot of you may have already figured out who this is, but if you haven't, it's NBA superstar LeBron James. Basketball was his refuge and his gift, but his purpose is to help kids in the same situation who didn't have his sort of generational physical talent and really might have missed out otherwise. He really wants people to have a fair shot, and that's super indicative because that it was not just about basketball, because this is the title of his movie. His purpose was always much deeper, and he had that clarity. So we talked about the what and the why. I'm going to just wrap up here, getting you started on the how, which can be a little bit of a journey, and it's going to be up to you. I first started writing about core values when I published Elevate in 2019. I started speaking about these 4 capacities and talked about it in the spirituality capacity chapter. Unfortunately, like it was always the question I got at, okay, I get it. Like, how do I figure out my core values? And there wasn't really an easy answer. My answer was it was complicated. It's not something you can share in a short Q&A. So I shared a few different resources, but because my dominant core value is find a better way and share it, I eventually took the process I designed for myself and our company, made it into a course. Thousands of people and hundreds of teams have taken it. And that process starts with these 6 questions. You don't have to write them all down. I'll share it at the QR code in the end. But they talk about environments where you have had success and not had success. And what you're going to do is you're going to answer these questions on a separate pieces of paper. You're going to start looking for themes, and then you're going to combine them into groups of those themes. But there's a key next step, and it's called the core validator. You got to make sure you have the right value and the right wording to make it actionable. So the first 2 are the right theme. These are how you know you're getting to the right theme. Too many people tend to focus on the catchy phrase before they get the theme right. That's very much the cart before the horse. The first question is, can you use it to make a decision? We talked about kind of how important decision making. And then there's the inverse of it cause discomfort. And this inverse thing is always one of the best validators of a core value, is how you react to the inverse. The inverse of a core value should be incredibly uncomfortable because it represents the living, breathing violation of your value. Good way to test this is an avatar. Like imagine the person who is the opposite of a value or values, and you're talking to them at a party. For someone like me with a core value of self-reliance, it would be the trust fund baby complaining about how they're not getting their next $500,000 distribution and telling me how their parent came to the job interview. This is what it feels like. This is the feeling of a value being violated. And then the second 2, once you have the theme right, are the right labeling. Can I objectively rate myself on it? That's how I know I'm doing this or I'm not doing this. And it's really hard to do this if it's not a phrase and it's just one word. So these are some examples of ones I hear a lot. I say these are not validated, kind of one word. They just mean too many things. They aren't good in decision making. Things that are validated have this sort of look for them. They're phrases, not single words. And look, so if I have someone on my team, whose core value I know is building trusting relationships, I'm not going to ask them to do something super transactional that has no personal involvement. I know that's kind of like putting a fish out of water. So to wrap up here, without core values clarity, I think you're always going to be a little bit stuck in the fog in some way. And with it, I believe strongly that you'll finally have the clarity that you need to meet your full potential. And at the end of the day, it's that potential that your friends, your family, and your community and your employees need most. So thank you, everyone. Everything I talked about today and the full framework for finding the core values is actually in my upcoming book, The Compass Within. You can also get the course for free if you pre-order it. It's right on the landing page. At the very least, I would tell you to start with the 6 questions. And you can get all of those along with a video that'll help you answer them and give you some examples if you go to robertglazer.com/6 or hit the QR code. So I would encourage you to start with this journey if you haven't done so yet. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's always so hard when I have to listen to such compelling content. So I get sucked in just like the audience, I'm sure. If there are any questions or comments, please do share them in the comments. I'm just listening to you there. I've really struggled personally with what are my values, and going through the past few years of a little voyage of self-discovery, and I've been really trying to think about that. But just listening to you then for 20 minutes started to draw out what some of them might be, actually, or one of them anyway. And it's one word which is wrong, so I need to examine it more. But fairness.
There's something probably with fair. And look, I won't put you on the spot, but my guess is like there was something in your life maybe that wasn't fair, that you felt that was not fair, right? Or someone who really espoused fairness, they come from those places. So answer the 6 questions and send them to me, and I'll look at your answers and I'll give you the feedback. But that is the best way to get started by far.
Thank you. I mean, these are going to be so ingrained within our own psyche. These values that you're discussing, how do they line up from an organizational perspective, or they're just totally
Yeah.
separate? Because
No,
I mean,
it's a great question. And if I had the 40-minute version, I would have addressed that. But look, if you're the founder and CEO of the organization, your core values are going to be very tied to the company's core values. They're not going to be perfect, but there'll be a lot of dotted lines, and that makes sense. And you're going to try to recruit people to the organization whose values connect to those values, but they're different, because an organizational core value is the collective DNA that we all value the most and that we share. And so it's like, what are the points of intersection? And your personal core values are yours. Now, if you work in a bigger organization or a leader or otherwise, you're going to want to make sure there's some alignment. If you get a sense of not sometimes what the company says on the wall, but what the actual values are, and yours are opposite, that's going to be pretty hard. It falls into that big three category.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It reminded me of an organization we came across probably about 9 years ago now, and one of our first ever winners in the UK, when we were the Employee Engagement Awards. And it was a football club, soccer, they're called Southampton, and they had the Southampton way, which is their culture and values, and they hired the $50 million striker to the nutritionist, the physio, the receptionist along their set of values, and tried to do marry that up as much as they possibly could, to great success. And it just made me think of what you were discussing then, made me think about that, but obviously going a few levels deeper. So so much in this, and packed into a short space of time. So thank you so much. And please do look up Robert. Thank you so much for being part of the summer series again.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.